Hello guys, welcome back once again to this lovely picture that I've been doing. I mean, I say lovely. I've been having so much fun doing this picture. Like I said today, or like it says in the thumbnail, today is going to be the last and final piece. And sorry for running as late as I am, but I've had a lot of things sort of uploading at the moment. As you can see there, I've uploaded yesterday's stream from Mixer. So don't forget to check that one out. But I'll be doing the digital version of V for Vendetta. I've already done a few layers, as you can see. I've put in a few details and already done that. But that is the picture that I drew through this week. Again, it's V for Vendetta, and I will be listening to the continuing on with the picture today, digitizing it. But I've done this and I've completely coloured it in. So if you want to go and check that one out, guys, definitely scroll down and put me in the corner so you can see the final piece of this one. This one has been completely coloured in, and I've added pictures to the added colour to the fireworks, and done V for Vendetta's black cloak and all its lovely colours on that one. I've done all this, and the Houses of Parliament have been coloured, and I've put a background to it. But today is the digital version. And I haven't, because I've been waiting for all that to upload, what I've done is I've done an outline to it already, and sort of just done the basic sort of lines that need to be done, because to be honest with you, this has taken me about an hour to actually get completely copied, just the Houses of Parliament. So this is why I've sort of done that off stream, and I've got that done already. And hopefully now I'm just sort of checking the different layers, making sure everything's where it should be. It doesn't really matter if that's going to be there. What I'll do is I'll add another layer, and then I'll call that one. Actually, no, I don't need to do anything for that. Sorry, I'll get rid of that. I don't need that layer at all. So let's get rid of that layer, remove that layer. But I've done all the layers, and I've still got the origin picture, so I will be drawing V as well. But first is give this a background, and I'll give the digital version a background. I won't do the sign until probably later on and towards the stream, if I do it all today. Again, I haven't got that much time, but if I don't get everything done today, I will come back so you can hear the rest of the playlist that I'm going to start very, very soon. Again, my name is Blut084, BLUT084, and this playlist in the background is the full story, or the graphic novel from this is what the film was based on, but the graphic novel graphic novel basically means a big comic. So if you're a fan of comics and you like things like that, I'm all about that, and I love to do things like that. So guys, keep tuned, keep listening, and I'll continue.
Substituted another in its place. That terrorist has been neutralized. If you want to hear
the rest of this playlist, guys, don't forget to check out the other videos at the very beginning. Is the beginning of the playlist that I'm listening to, and exactly it continues throughout the drawing sessions.
One of those Bugs Bunny cartoon moments, and of course it was. The cigar exploded with a large bang and a thick puff of smoke, and then, while the audience broke into screaming peals of laughter, some under-costume tubing appeared to send steam shooting out of the raging Chancellor's ears.
I can see any comments that come in. You can chat to me live while I'm here. So if you want to, guys, just hit that live chat button and say hi.
And seemed to notice for the first time V hiding among them.
Chat.
"Oh my God, Chancellor!" he exclaimed in surprise, pointing with a finger that shot out just past the Chancellor's nose. "Look! A terrorist!" cried Sutler, leaping to his feet, and immediately Pratt falling forward on his face as the knotted laces between his feet pulled tight. "Get him!" the Chancellor commanded next, rolling to a sitting position and starting to untie his shoes. And the soldiers who had been seen earlier dashed forward and began chasing V round the stage, accompanied by the tittering, tottering showgirls. Then the whole crew scampered out into the audience and back to the stage again, while the orchestra played an exaggeratedly speeded-up accompaniment, and the audience went wild with laughter. And all through this madcap chase, reminiscent of the closing scenes of an ancient Benny Hill show, Gordon Dietrich sat benignly in his chair, obviously enjoying his finest moment ever on the air, impeccable and impervious to the chaos all around him. And Evie could only stare in horrified shock, almost unaware that Dietrich was sitting there beside her, enjoying the experience, the glory, all over again. At last, the soldiers, one or two of whom had managed to capture Showgirls by mistake, finally caught V and wrestled him to the ground. And now Sutler, on his feet and all his freedom of movement fully restored, stepped forward and reached toward V's mask. "At last!" he cried. "And now for all the world to see!" But as the mask was ripped away, another surprise was revealed, stunning both soldiers and audience alike. For the terrorist turned out to be another Sutler look-alike, and as the soldiers looked on with their mouths hanging open comically, he leapt to his feet, tossed aside the hat, cloak, and wig, and revealed himself wearing exactly the same suit as the first impersonator. "Unhand me!" he cried. "I'm your Chancellor!" "What?" the first Sutler exploded. "How dare you? I'm the Chancellor!" "Imposter!" came the pantomime response, and then they lunged at each other, going down in a tumbling ball of flailing fists and thrashing legs, until, wound together like a Mobius strip, it became quite impossible to tell one Chancellor from the other. All it really needed to complete the humiliating farce was for their pants to fall down, revealing red and white polka dot boxer shorts. But it seemed even Gordon hadn't dared to go that far. Or perhaps he just hadn't thought of it. Finally, they broke apart and leapt to their feet, pointing furiously at each other, and one cried, "Soldiers, that man is the terrorist!" And the other screamed, "I order you to shoot that traitor, that liar, that fake, that fraud! Ready, aim, fire!" A staccato rattle of automatic weaponry as the soldiers opened fire, and then the two Sutlers slapped concealed blood capsules against their chests and spun to the ground, the curtain crashing down just after they hit the deck. And the audience went wild, in a way that no one could quite have anticipated. Certainly not the man who sat watching his TV set with a glass of warm milk gripped rigidly in one hand, staring as Dietrich made a profound, theatrical bow and disappeared behind the curtain. Was still staring, and the masked, smiling face of V appeared through the slit in the curtain a moment later, grin seeming wider than ever, and twisted his mustaches once again. And the audience cheered. Cheered. And the glass of milk shattered in the aging man's hand. Evie was still watching, in a similar shock that was now rapidly
readjust things a little bit, guys, because I noticed you can see
not clutching her champagne glass quite so hard when the phone rang. Dietrich, still chuckling to himself, put down his own glass.
That should work a bit better for you. Yeah, you can see everything.
He listened for a while, but seemed quite impervious.
Again, guys, if you want to leave a comment, you can leave one down below.
What are they going to do?
Background now.
Still buoyed up
if I don't talk too much, guys, that is why I've got playlists in the background, so you can listen and enjoy.
On the air. A pause, and then, "Well, you're a lawyer. That's what I pay you for. Protect me." And with that, he hung up. "I should have hired him years ago to be my mother," he said, smiling as he turned back to Evie. "You're mad," she told him bluntly, still not quite believing what she'd just seen. "Either that or I wasn't breastfed," he quipped. "Is everything a joke to you?" "Only the things that matter." Though he looked a little more serious as he said that, it was obvious that she just wasn't able to get through to him. Right at the moment, probably no one could. "Gordon, what if they come after you?" she asked, finally managing to express the dread she felt. Not just for him, but for both of them. "Look," he said reassuringly, sitting down and taking her hand, "I'll tell you what's going to happen. I'll have to make some kind of apology and do some boring fundraiser, and in the meantime our ratings will go through the roof. Trust me, it'll be fine." She tried to nod, tried to smile, but it was quite obvious to both of them that she wasn't convinced. As the hours passed and the stars wheeled away the time, the gilded moon drew a veil of cloud across her face, almost as if she no longer had the stomach to watch events in the world of men below. And the night became very dark indeed. The sound of breaking glass woke Evie, that icy tinkle that froze the heart and shattered the silence, her dreams and her world. It was followed by a loud thump, and movement started once again. The movement of people down in the house below, the thunderous pumping of her heart. "Gordon?" she queried desperately, sitting up in bed, overwhelmed by the feeling that she'd been through all this before. But it shouldn't be happening all over again. Surely it couldn't be happening again. It was. And the dreadful fear that she'd almost managed to forget since she'd arrived in Bloomsbury, that
Morning,
was back
Nikki.
again too.
It's coming in now.
Echoed
I'd
through the
already
house,
done the
and then there was the sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs,
outlining.
as they
I did
reached
that
the landing,
while I was waiting for the other
pounding
thing to
for
load up.
water. And then
It's taking too
Gordon
long,
Dietrich
so I just
burst
started
into
doing
her
it.
room, slamming the door
As
behind
you
him,
can see here, I've
wearing
already
a
done
robe and lathered in
the
sweat,
outlines
gasping for
from the
breath,
previous,
the whites of his eyes bright in the
and
darkness.
just sort of colouring it in now.
All happening again.
I would have done all this, but this
Evie,
actually took
he
me an
managed
hour
show
to
her
outline the
quickly,
whole thing, so
throwing
I'm
his
kind of glad I
considerable
didn't do it
bulk
on
back
screen.
against the door. Quick! For a moment, Evie just wanted to burst into tears, to shut her eyes and make it all go away when she opened them again, to be a little girl once more, wrapped up in the love of her mummy and daddy, surrounded by the toys that she loved in her turn, with Teddy, to hug him close and say the magic word that set the world aright. But there was no magic word, and nothing would set this right now. Panic took over then, and she rolled out of the bed, hit the floor hard, and scrambled into the shadows beneath the bedstead. Lay there quaking with terror, remembering how she'd done exactly the same thing before, and all the terrible things that had followed. Repetitions and coincidences. As if God only had a limited number of stories to tell per individual person, and just wanted to replay them over and over, making his cast jump through the same hoops time after time, until they finally collapsed with exhaustion, or until, perhaps, they'd learned the lesson they needed to and managed to escape the play into the world of greater freedom outside the theatre. Only instants later, the door exploded from its hinges, throwing Dietrich aside like a limp sack. As he staggered, trying to regain his balance, a swarm of heavily armed, dark-clad paramilitary fingermen flooded into the room. "What do you think?" he managed to get out, but a rifle butt smashed into his mouth and cut the question short. Beneath the bed, Evie could see only Dietrich's bare feet, seeming pale and old and Venus against the polished black leather boots. And think how terribly vulnerable they looked as the fingermen took their prisoner in hand. Then Peter Creedy was there, gloating, his favourite, well-used truncheon in his hand. It flailed down with a sick thud, then landed again with much more of a bony crack. "Not so funny now, is it, funny man?" he grunted, as Dietrich sobbed and gurgled for breath. Another hit. And then the most famous television face in the land, now that Louis Prothero was gone, hit the floor hard and looked toward the fugitive under the bed. And both of them knew that that face, now split open like the skin of a watermelon to reveal the red pulp within, would never be seen on television again. He tried to say something, to beg them to stop the kicking they were continuing to give him, even as they zip-tied his hands behind his back, but his jaw was broken, and all he could manage was a gurgling scream. He writhed.
Are you still in that hotel that you did on your channel?
His eyes searched for Evie, locked with her own.
Or have you managed to reach brother and dad now?
Again. She could only stare back helplessly, remembering the way it had happened to her parents.
That's
and how her
Nicole Jean,
mother
guys.
looked at her
She's
just like
an
feeling the
author.
panic attack clutching
Done a
at
few
her
pictures
throat,
together.
starting
She has
to
a YouTube
hyperventilate.
channel. If you want to go and check that one out, it's Nicole Jean.
Again.
Click her
Trying
name
not to
and you
scream
should be able
as
to
he
go
yanked
straight
the
to her
shiny
channel.
black bag over
But
his
keep
head
watching
and pulled it
and keep
tight
listening.
around his neck like a noose.
Or come back
again
and check it anytime.
Again.
Because this will not go anywhere.
Still sick.
This will stay on the channel until YouTube decides it's not going to be YouTube anymore.
Angry hate for Peter Creedy and his fingermen, and their arrogant, vicious, and appallingly casual brutality. For Adam Sattler and his party, who gave the finger their orders, and who had turned this country into a hell in the name of making it a heaven. To a lesser extent for Gordon Dietrich, for being so wonderfully, stupidly heroic in launching his satirical attack on the evils of the world, and never being wise enough to realize the dire consequences that his foolhardy actions would bring, but most of all, for herself. For for she felt responsible for all that had happened, for giving him someone to show off his bravery to, for being here in the first place and landing him with someone to protect, for not having the same sort of courage that he'd had in standing up against them. And still, no matter what she might think of what he was doing, she hated herself for betraying V's trust. Most of all, she hated the fear she'd always felt, which had never let her live the life she wanted to live and held her paralyzed and quaking beneath the bed even now, despite the self-loathing it provoked. Then they hauled Gordon Dietrich to his feet, his old, bare feet now spattered with dripping blood, and dragged him out the door, laughing as they did so. And there was nothing she could do to help him. Nothing anyone could do now. Sound receded from the house then, like the ebbing of the tide. The footsteps going down the stairs, the slamming of the front door.
Just a quick question, Nicole, and anybody that may be watching. Do you enjoy this playlist in the background, this graphic novel? Because I'm thinking of doing a few more series like this.
Pushed her way out from under the bed, knowing she dared not stay.
Take away from Story, but I kind of run out of things to listen to on them.
To search the place more thoroughly, not for proof against Dietrich after the evening television show.
I'm doing Fire and Fireworks this month.
What's going to happen to him now? But for evidence of accomplices, of fellow conspirators plotting together to satirize and overthrow the state, perhaps even if their surveillance was good for her. If indeed everyone had left the house, she thought, dressing hurriedly and silently. For all she knew, fingermen might be lurking there still, just waiting for anyone who, thinking silence meant safety, might now emerge from a hiding place and, seeking to escape, fall into their hands like ripe fruit dropping from a tree. Not the front door, then. Instead, she climbed out the open bedroom window and crawled out onto a small roof beyond. The roof overlooked the back garden behind the house, and she slid down to its edge, grabbing the guttering before she fell right off. Even so, when she peered over, the ground still looked too far away to risk a jump. She threw one leg over the edge of the roof, then the other, scrabbling for a handhold that would stop her sliding, and managed to ease her body over the edge. She hoped desperately that the gutter would take her weight as she grabbed it hurriedly, feeling herself slipping out of control, going down quickly, catching her jaw a glancing blow on the gutter edge, then falling until she felt her arms snap out straight. She winced with pain at the pull on suddenly stretched joints and shoulders, then felt the gutter pull out of its brackets, and she was falling, trying desperately in that instant to remember whether it was better to keep her legs straight or bent, and deciding on the latter. Then hitting the ground with a soft thump, thankful that she'd remembered right, but sprawling heavily on a concrete patio nonetheless. She stayed low as a flashlight shone out from inside the house, swung across the garden, and then turned back inside. Lights and shadows moved around eerily within, all the more threatening for the accompanying silence. Obviously, they were still searching, waiting for some betraying sound or movement. And as Dietrich had been known to live alone, she realized that meant they were looking for her. Taking a deep breath and trying to calm herself, she began to wriggle away across the patio on her belly, made it to a bed of shrubbery, and began to crawl through it toward the garden gate. No thought of how dirty her clothes must be getting, of how the branches were pulling at her hair, but not even of where she might go from here. Escape was the only thing she had on her mind at that moment.
That's everything.
And if she had to keep running until she'd left the country entirely, then
so as guys, I've got layers here. So this piece here that I've actually coloured over doesn't actually make a spot of difference, because I can now go to another layer
Now, then,
and overcolour that, and
anywhere away
overcolour
from
anything.
here, though she still had no idea.
But I will do that in a moment.
At all. Perhaps the best idea was to try to get out of London.
I want to finish off
even
here,
after the
so I'm going back
quarantine
to
safe
Parliament.
zones the government had established.
This one here, again, I outlined everything, and it's on its own layer. And what I do with that layer is you've got a layer underneath so you can colour it like I just did, so you don't overlap any of the lines I've already done. Let's just give you a quick idea of what I'm saying here. So I can make that one nice and big again. So if I was to do that, oh dear, oh no, I've gone over the same layer, so best gone. So that's why you've got different layers.
But no sooner had she started to move than a hand landed on her shoulder, jerking her
make different
backward,
things. So you've got a colour layer and a layer that you've done your actual artwork on. I kind of like that outline actually. It's kind of cool.
Masculine voice behind her, and though she tried to look back over her shoulder as she felt the plastic.
See, there's the under layer
around her wrists.
and there's the top layer on top.
Faceless figure in the deeper darkness of the night. But if she couldn't see who, she certainly knew what. A finger.
Minimize that. Go hard.
She squealed frantically, shaking helplessly in horrified, bowel-loosening fear. No, please! But plead, shriek, or fight as she might, there was no escape. Nothing that could be done to stop the black plastic bag from being drawn over her head, being tightened round her neck, and drowning out her piercing scream of absolute, abject terror. 16. When they pulled the black bag off, Evie had lost all track of time. She remembered being roughly dragged along, half fainting, and thrust into a truck, remembered the noise of its engine, the raucous chatter of the guards, and even their very breathing, the smell of them, and the odour of her own fear, surprised despite her terror at how swiftly, when the sense of sight was removed, the other senses had become heightened. And the one thing that she did have to be thankful for was that she hadn't been sick inside the bag. Although, with the way she thought of herself now, that humiliation would have seemed like a deserved punishment. For it seemed to her it was fear that had brought all this on her, and whatever happened to her from now on, she had only herself to blame. She was sure she'd passed out at some point, but whether that was before or after they buffeted her out of the truck, dragged her down some stairs and shoved her along a corridor, she couldn't tell. The sound of a shutting door and the grating of its lock was clear enough, and she remembered how they'd merely dumped her on a stone-cold floor without food, without water, without toilet facilities. And so she had no alternative, eventually, but just to let go on the floor. And somehow that seemed a small revenge in itself. How long had passed after that before a guard came to collect her, she had no idea. He called her a dirty little cow, but he finally freed her sore, chafed wrists from the zip ties and dragged her here, somewhere, and sat her down roughly in a chair. And then they did, at last, remove the hood. She so wanted to look, to see where she was, just to use her eyes again, but the lights that shone in her face were so brilliant, and her pupils were so distended from the long darkness that she had no alternative but to shut them again. But in that instant she'd managed to see a desk before her, and the dark shape of a man sitting opposite, behind the lights that shone full in her face. "Do you know why you are here, Evie Hammond?" he said coldly, and blinking and squinting she tried to open her eyes again, only to see nothing but red shapes that flared upon her retina, and an unmoving shadow to whom she addressed a simple, "Please." She tried to look round her then, but as she did so, a hand cuffed round the back of her head from behind, making it quite clear that she was to keep her attention on the interrogator before her, and nowhere else. But in the instant she'd been able to see, she'd taken in a bare room, windowless, and with nothing to break the monotony of the blank walls but a "Strength through unity, unity through faith" poster. "You are being formally charged with 3 counts of murder," the interrogator continued matter-of-factly, but not without a hint of malice. "The bombing of government property and conspiracy to commit acts of terrorism, treason, and sedition, the penalty for which is death by firing squad." Evie felt as if every word were a punch in the stomach. This was everything she dreaded, and every bit as bad as it could get, all laid out in the plainest terms. The only relief was that they hadn't put a bullet through her brain already, as she rather suspected they would have done with Gordon Dietrich. That they hadn't must mean that there was some reason for keeping her alive, something they wanted from her. She opened her mouth then, but nothing came out. "You have one chance and only one chance to save your life," the interrogator continued, and now she detected a trace of eagerness in his voice. Strange the way her hearing seemed to have become almost supernaturally heightened in the few hours she'd been forced to rely on it most of all. Not just sensitive to the slightest whisper, but to nuance and tone beside. "You must tell us the identity or whereabouts of code name V," the voice said next. "If the information leads to his capture, You will be immediately released from this facility. Do you understand what I'm telling you? There it was. The deal she'd wanted to make when she'd almost betrayed V to the bishop. The last, best hope she'd clung to all along. Until, when was it? Last night? Until they'd come along and done what they'd done to Gordon Dietrich. Poor old, foolish, brave Gordon Dietrich. You can return to your normal life, Miss Hammond, the man emphasized, seeming to her watering eyes to lean forward until he was almost, but not quite, visible in the light. All you have to do is cooperate. Cooperate. And go free. If she could believe them. If they didn't shoot her as soon as she told them everything she knew. Evie began hesitantly, hesitated some more, and sucked in a breath. I don't know. Process her, Rossiter, the man said shortly, disappointment adding venom to the words. And while she was still looking round, dazzled to see whom the command had been addressed to, rough hands grabbed her from behind, bagged her head again, and once more dragged her away.
I don't put a colour there. It will appear.
She wept when they shaved her head. She didn't mean to, didn't want to, but her hair was the one thing about her appearance that she'd always been proud of, always thought her best feature. And as the rough hand ran the crude, hurtful electric clippers over her scalp, as the long blonde tresses rained down on the floor, she felt that this, more than anything, was stripping away the sense of identity that she'd clung to for years. With this, she was no longer Evie Hammond. She was just a prisoner, without even a number, a cipher, a subject, nobody. A nobody who was very, very afraid. But then they'd known the head shaving would make her feel like this, which was why they'd done it in the first place. There might be physical torture later, but first there would be humiliation. They stripped her clothes away next, took her naked into a room and manacled her wrists to a ceiling hook, then left her dangling while they hosed her down with powerful jets of water that buffeted her, left her breathless, bruised her, and eventually became more a form of torture than the washing and delousing it pretended to be. And then, while her skin was still raw and pink and hurting, they pulled a rough hemp dress down over her head, more like a penitent's hair shirt than anything else, refused her any shoes or underwear, and dragged her away to a cell. A cell with one small window, too high up to see out of, and an electric socket in the ceiling without a light bulb, so when the day ended, there was only darkness. A grill in the door looked out into a dank corridor with, directly opposite, another of those strength through unity, unity through faith posters, whose message she'd long ago ceased to believe in. She had no faith, and fearfully little strength, and she now realized unity for this government meant little more than murdering anyone who disagreed with anything it said. There was a bare shelf to sleep on without any bedding, and a bucket that served as a toilet which no one bothered to empty until it was full, and a rat hole down by the floor where the only other inhabitant of the cell emerged after dark to run over her body in the night, to eat her dress while she slept, to bite her while she lay there stupefied with terror. And then they offered her food. One look was enough to make her want to vomit, because vomit was exactly what the food they offered looked like. Even the rat wouldn't touch it. Why didn't they just kill her straight away? She was sure they were going to, regardless of whether she cooperated, so why not do the merciful thing and kill her now? But mercy wasn't on their agenda, of course, and besides, she desperately wanted to live. Her sense of time began to blur again. The minutes passed somehow, but with only 4 stone walls to look at that increasingly stupid poster, there was nothing to divert her attention. At any hour of the day or night, they'd drag her away for further questioning, for beatings, torture, and humiliation. They showed her surveillance camera footage from the alley where first she'd met V, accused her of being a plant, sent in by the terrorist to distract the fingermen before he moved in to kill and maim them. When she denied it, they questioned her furiously about what he'd said to her afterward, then pointed out how obvious it was that she'd willingly left the scene with him, showed her more footage taken near the Old Bailey and at Westminster, demanding to know how she explained her presence there. And more than that, how did she account for her ID being used at Lewis Prothero's apartment building? Told her, too, that the young priest at the deanery had positively identified her as V's accomplice in the murder of the bishop, and how did she explain that? And what was the terrorist going to do next? Endless, endless questions. And when she couldn't or wouldn't answer, and even her interrogator was becoming exasperated, the man Rossiter would drench her with buckets of water and take her back, cold and shivering, to her cell. She slept whenever she could, unconsciousness being her only escape. But always it seemed to her that as soon as she fell asleep, a loudspeaker would boom into life, and a military band would play Sutler's recently written national anthem over and over, sometimes for hours on end, until she couldn't stand it anymore. And then they'd thrash her with thin bamboo canes until her skin was raw, and even if she wanted to sleep, she couldn't possibly lie down. That was the part Rossiter seemed to enjoy the most. The beatings, the cigarette burns, the humiliation. An evil, sadistic thug, he was everything she'd expected a fingerman torturer to be, and the only surprise to her was that he stopped short of inflicting permanent physical damage. But with everything else added to the random acts of violence, the sleep deprivation, the interrogation, the miserable state of her cell, the mental damage being caused was quite enough. Eventually, so disoriented she thought it was night when the light shone through the window and day when it was dark, she began to eat the food. That made her cry in itself, that she'd reached that point of degradation where she'd eat that filth. But crying was what she did most of the time anyway, when they gave her a minute to herself. And the rat came and went, providing the only entertainment she had, the only companionship, love bites in the dark. And when the rat's attentions were all she had left to look forward to, she realized there really wasn't any nowhere to go. No better than a rat. Probably worse. And then the rat didn't come anymore either, and her loneliness was absolutely complete. And the light shone through the window sometimes, and sometimes it didn't, and the questioning never stopped. Eventually, in one of those periods of total silence that somehow had become even more difficult to sleep in than the periods of continual noise, she heard a faint scratching sound from the hole down at the foot of the wall. Thinking joyfully that her rat had at last returned, she uncoiled slowly from the fetal ball in which she'd been trying to sleep, painfully eased her emaciated body off the bed shelf, and crawled across the floor. There was no rat. But something else was in the hole, something that had been pushed through from the other side. A small roll of toilet paper. Evie looked at it in astonishment. Toilet paper was something she hadn't seen since she was arrested, something she'd almost forgotten existed. Even more astonishing was that this little roll of paper had writing on it. Crude and in pencil, it looked like the sort of script she'd expect to write herself after weeks of torture and starvation. It could only be, she thought, a message from the prisoner in the cell next door, unless this was just another malicious fraud on the part of her interrogators. Either way, it gave her something to do, something to read, a voice from somewhere outside her own personal hell. And if anything could fill up even a minute of the long, lonely hours, she'd gratefully accept it, no matter where it came from, just so long as it didn't mention V, or ask her to explain anything. Dragging herself over into the light from the window and propping herself up against the wall, she began to unroll the fragile missive. I know there's no way I can convince you that this is not one of their tricks, but I don't care. I am me. My name is Valerie. I don't think I will live much longer, and I wanted to tell someone about my life. I'm writing this with a pencil that I hid inside of me. This is the only autobiography that I will ever write, and, oh God, I'm writing it on toilet paper. Another woman. And that seemed important to Evie. even if it turned out that they had entirely different backgrounds. They still had that basic something in common, the shared gender, the sense of being women together in trouble, of being sisters under the skin, as the old cliché had it. Avidly she read on. I was born in Nottingham. I don't remember much about my early years, but I do remember the rain. My grandmother owned a farm in Tottlebrook, and she used to tell me that God was in the rain. The sound of rain tapping on a window has always felt like home. I passed my 11 plus and went to girls' grammar. Secondary school. Something Evie had never known, having spent most of her teenage years after the arrest of her parents in the Juvenile Reclamation Project, a hellish young offenders institution over in Wapping, and that had featured an educational curriculum of an entirely different sort: fear, brutality, abuse, and the Bible, followed by the rote slogan learning they called political re-education. Strength through unity, unity through faith. England prevails. The different are the damned, and on and on and on. And the pointless marching, and hold your arm out straighter when you're saluting, girl. Beatings for the slightest misdemeanor, and as soon as it looked as if you might be making a friend, they maliciously split you apart somehow, sent your chum to another wing, another prison, another world. Grammar school. School friends. Teenage romance. What on earth could it have been like? It was at school that I met my first girlfriend. Her name was Sarah. It was her wrists. They were beautiful. I thought we would love each other forever. I remember our teacher telling us that it was an adolescent phase that people grew out of. Sarah did. I didn't.
Just going to take a quick picture for Instagram, guys, and post out what I'm doing and what I'm getting up to.
Evie began to weep again, knowing that under any normal circumstances she wouldn't. But her nerves were so frayed, her emotions so near the surface, it was just impossible not to. Eventually, sniffing and trying to pull herself together, she had no handkerchief on which to blow her nose, and that thought made her weep again to think so suddenly of her mother.
Again, my name is Blut084, BLUT084, Art and Games, here every day on YouTube, occasionally on Mixer, and I've been doing a lot more on Mixer lately, so if you want to go and check those out, you can do by the uploads that I've been bringing out this week, or if you are enjoying today's art, there is loads more art and information on what I'm getting up to throughout this month over on Instagram. Same name, different place.
It is the very last inch of us. But within that inch, we are free. Evie heard them coming for her again then. In sudden panic, knowing full well they'd take the message away from her if they found it, she managed to wriggle across the floor and stuff it back into the rat hole. She couldn't let them have it. Not now. When she'd just discovered a lifeline, a contact with something outside her own personal hell. A magic word that opened up another world. Rossiter, the guard, came and black-bagged her head again, as they always seemed to do when moving her round her prison, then manacled her hands behind her and took her into the usual interrogation room, and stood her over a table on which, she saw when the hood was removed, was placed a large, full bowl of water. He looked over toward the usual interrogator briefly, asked her yet again about V, and when she yet again had nothing to say, pushed her face down into the water and held her down for what seemed like hours. She came up, spluttering and choking, and almost before she had time to gasp in another breath, her head was thrust down below the surface again. "It ends whenever you want it to," the interrogator told her from behind the lights when she was eventually pulled up again. She merely looked at him, dead-eyed. Down into the water again, this time held under, it seemed, to within an inch of her life. And Valerie's words came back to her then. "It is the very last inch of us, but within that inch we are free." "Just tell us where he is," she was asked again. Integrity, she thought. The very last inch. "I don't know," she told him. Eventually, when they were as tired of hearing the same answer as she was of giving it, and when it seemed that just one more semi-drowning would make her heart give out, they dragged her limp body back to the filthy, mephitic cell. It seemed like hours before she felt strong enough to roll across the floor and pluck out the roll that had already become an almost sacred text to her. I moved to London. I'd never been so happy. I'd always known what I wanted to do with my life. A couple of years later, I starred in my first film, The Salt Flats. It was the most important role in my life, not because of my career, but because that was how I met Ruth. The first time we kissed, I knew that I never wanted to kiss any other's lips again but hers. We moved into a small flat in London together. She grew violet castles on the balcony for me, and our kitchen always smelled of roses. Those were the best years of my life. But America's war grew worse and worse, and eventually the same sort of hell came to London. After that, there were no roses anymore. Not for anyone. Surprisingly quickly, Rossiter came for her again, stuck her head in the black bag she'd used to dread so much but was now past caring about, shackled her hands behind her, and simply left her lying on the floor. Total silence fell after he left and locked the door, and she could only lie there in sensory deprivation and total uncertainty for an unknown time that seemed to last forever, leaving her alone to think, but probably not of the subjects they wanted her to think about. Of Valerie, and the world's curious parallels and repetitions. An actress, just as Evie had always wanted to be, until the world had gone to hell, the world in general, and her personal world. After all, whatever other things one might learn in a juvenile reclamation project, lying, cheating, stealing, and fighting, to name only a few, acting certainly wasn't one. But if Evie could envy Valerie that brief joy, there was nothing to be envied in the way that she too had ended up in this prison hell. And all, it seemed, for love. For loving too well, too honestly, too bravely. Eventually the hood was removed, the shackles too, and then the guard was leaning down to shout in her face, "You won't last much longer. You're going to die here. Why protect someone who doesn't give a shit about you?" She stared at him blank-eyed, hardly knowing the answer to that question herself. Except that was what they wanted from her, and she wasn't going to give it to them. So when he'd gone, and when she felt strong enough, she began to read once again, to read an unfamiliar person's viewpoint on familiar things. No, that wasn't true. Valerie wasn't unfamiliar to her now. Unless they'd taken her away as soon as she'd forced the message through the hole, Valerie was sitting in the cell next door. Valerie was her companion in adversity, her friend, her only friend, the last one she had in the world. Unless she was already dead. Dead. What did that mean? Weren't they all dead in here? Weren't they, perhaps with one single exception, all dead in the England of today? Hadn't they been for years? And wasn't that why they were in the situation they found themselves in today? How long ago had the nation become a corpse? And how had it happened? I remember how the meaning of words began to change. How unfamiliar words like collateral damage and extraordinary rendition became frightening, while things like Norse fire and articles of allegiance became so powerful. And I remember how different became dangerous. I still don't understand it. Why do they hate us so much? They took Ruth while she was out looking for food. I've never cried so hard in my life. It wasn't long until they came for me. And Evie could only cry again in turn, knowing exactly what must have happened. Ruth must have cracked under torture, or even just the threat of it. Told them everything, the relationship, Valerie's name, the address, all exchanged for a life that Evie knew wouldn't have been worth living afterward, the sort of life that ends in suicide. They called me a criminal and told me my films would be burned. They shaved my hair. They held my head down a toilet and molested me. They've injected me with chemicals. My skin is covered in purple bruises and I can't feel my tongue anymore. It seems strange that my life should end in such a terrible place. But for 3 years I had roses and apologized to no one. I shall die here. Every inch of me shall perish. Every inch but one. An inch. It's small and fragile, and it's the only thing in the world worth having. We must never lose it or give it away. We must never let them take it away from us. I hope that whoever you are, you escape this place. I hope that the world turns and that things get better. But what I hope most of all is that you understand what I mean when I tell you that even though I do not know you, and even though I may never meet you, laugh with you, cry with you, or kiss you, I love you. With all my heart, I love you. Valerie. And, still sobbing, Evie could do nothing else but kiss that signature, that testament on toilet paper. And doing so, she kissed the world entire. She knew when they next bagged her and took her away, whether it was from intuition or some subtle difference in Rossiter's attitude, that she was fast approaching the end. And when the hood was removed, and she sat there blinking in the interrogation lights, the end was there indeed. "I have been told to inform you," the man behind the desk began, "that you have been convicted by a special tribunal, and that unless you are ready to offer your cooperation, you are to be executed. Do you understand what I am telling you?" "Yes," she said softly, staring at the silhouetted head, trying to look the man straight in the eye. "Are you ready to cooperate?" "No." And in the silence that followed, the tiniest hint of a smile passed across her lips. "Very well," the man said in a voice that mingled weary exasperation and puzzled incomprehension, and then continued to Rossiter, unseen behind her. "Escort Miss Hammond back to her cell. Arrange a detail of 6 men. Then take her out behind the chemical sheds and shoot her." If they expected any reaction to that, they didn't get it. The black bag was placed over her head one last time, and just for a moment the thought ran through her head that she wouldn't have to put up with that anymore. But then she wouldn't actually have to put up with anything ever again. Evie was still holding Valerie's letter when Rossiter came for the final time. She had thought to take it with her to her death, one last sentimental gesture, a treasure to take with her to the grave. But why? Ultimately, you couldn't take anything with you. Not anything physical, anyway. Only the one small thing she'd come to treasure most of all: integrity. Instead, she placed the letter reverently on the bed shelf and stood up, and remembered suddenly a tale told to her by her father long ago that she'd never quite understood at the time, of how a Tibetan Buddhist monk, escaping the Chinese soldiers swarming through his country, had almost crossed the Himalayas to safety when he was told that his entire family, left behind after being given assurances of safety, had just been killed. And while his companions could only receive the news with horror, all the monk could do was laugh. And how, asked about the incident in later years, he had said that that was the nearest he had ever come to enlightenment. For everything was gone then, and there was nothing left but release. "It's time," said Rossiter, staring at her from the open doorway. "I'm ready," she said, getting to her feet with an almost beatific smile. "All I want is one little piece of information," he said, showing the slightest touch of human warmth, something that he'd never shown before, as if, in the end, he wanted her to survive after all, despite everything. As if he couldn't understand why she wouldn't give in, when he most surely would. Just give them something. Anything. "Thank you," she said, an almost mischievous sparkle in her eye. "I'd rather die behind the chemical sheds." "Then you have no fear anymore," he said, trying to suppress a smile. "You are completely free." And he turned and left the cell door standing open too. Evie, completely taken aback, could only stand and stare, and eventually, listening to the footsteps receding down the corridor, choke out a single word. "What?" 17. Stunned, Evie stepped toward the entrance, all her previous composure evaporating with every pace. She reached out to touch the door nervously, unable to quite believe it hadn't been relocked. Then, tentatively, she stuck her head out into the hall beyond and saw nobody. This didn't make sense, but the guard had said she was free. And what had she got to lose now, when a few moments earlier she'd been expecting immediate execution? If they captured her again, she'd be no worse off than before. With that, she stepped out into the corridor and noticed that the plain brick wall with a poster pasted on it seemed to extend for only a few feet to either side, to the limits of her vision from the cell door grille, in fact, before being replaced by a much more normal plastered wall. That seemed strange in itself, but then, of course, she'd always made the journey from her cell to the interrogation room with a bag over her head. More puzzling was that there didn't seem to be any other grille-doored cells anywhere in sight, as if her own was the only one especially constructed for her alone. But that meant, of course, that there was no cell next door. No Valerie. Shaking her head in confusion, she walked, there just seemed no need to even think of running, toward its end, rounded the corner cautiously, and hesitated. Ahead of her stood a uniformed guard. Was it Rossiter? But something about his frozen stare, his absolute stillness, kept her from turning back. And the more she looked, the more lifeless he seemed. A mannequin. She strode toward him then, noticing a door behind him, a door that also opened as she turned the handle and pushed her way on through. The interrogation room next, with all its lights, far closer to her cell than it had ever seemed when she hadn't been able to see her way as they led her to it. Another mannequin sitting at the table, and underneath it, a tape player, wires leading up to a small speaker by the mannequin's throat. And then another room with a guard's uniform and a flesh mask she recognized as Rossiter's face, a Fedco uniform and another mask, others still that were completely unfamiliar to her. And on a table, a small wire cage containing a rat. Her rat. What on earth did it all mean? Mannequins, disguises, cells that weren't really cells, a prison that wasn't really a prison. There was only one way to find out, and that was to continue until one of these doors opened to the outside world, or at least to something less confusing. The next door down the corridor was, finally, the one she sought. She opened it, tentatively, and cautiously stepped through, and found herself standing once more, to her most intense surprise, in the shadow gallery. The shadow gallery. At first it just didn't register properly. A place she'd never thought to see again, had no reason to expect that she'd ever be returning here. Was this too another pretense? A studio-set imitation of the real shadow gallery? No. Somehow, as she ran her eyes over the assembled treasures the place contained, she knew that this was the real thing, which meant that her prison had always been part of the shadow gallery too. But how could it be? This belief almost overwhelmed her, but there was V, standing before her, wearing his mask as always, and this was definitely not a mannequin. "Hello, Evie," he said simply, with a certain warmth that indicated a pride in her accomplishments, though little more than that, as if he was waiting for a chance to judge what her reaction might be. Pleasure, shock, disgust. But her first reaction was one of complete incomprehension. "You," she began, startled, but then her mouth simply hung open while she stared. At him, at where she was, at a world that was not contained entirely in the concept prison cell. "It was you?" she said at last. "That wasn't real." "Is Gordon—" "I'm sorry, but Mr. Dietrich is dead," he told her, genuine compassion in his voice. "I thought they'd just arrest him, but when they found the Quran in his house and everything else, they had him executed." The Quran wouldn't have been half of it, she knew, not even a small part. Among all the other stuff, it would have been God Save the Queen that got Gordon killed. Oh, God, said Evie flatly, hearing everything she'd suspected now finally confirmed. Fortunately, V continued gently, I got to you before they did. You got to me? She said, not quite understanding the significance of his words. You did this to me? And then it hit her. All that had happened in the last, how long was it? Days, weeks, months, had all been his doing. Rossiter, the interrogator, him in disguise, and that Fedco truck in the street on the Sunday night that she'd arrived in Bloomsbury, that must have been him as well, keeping an eye on her whereabouts in disguise. But mainly, he'd been Rossiter. She stumbled back against the wall, feeling as if her legs would hardly support her. You cut my hair. You tortured me. You tortured me. She began to shake, realizing at last just how thin she'd become, how weak, how sick. And V nodded his head almost sadly, admitting and confirming everything. Why? She asked him disbelievingly. God, why? He hesitated then, as if having to explain his actions was almost as painful as having carried them out in the first place. You said you wished to live without fear. I wish there was an easier way, but there wasn't. Evie felt her stomach turning over and covered her mouth as she began to retch, but there was nothing in her stomach to bring up. I know you may never forgive me, V said, taking a pace toward her as if genuinely concerned. Nor will you ever understand how hard it was for me to do what I did. Every day I saw in myself what you see in me now. Every day I wanted to end it, but each time you refused to give in. I knew I couldn't. You're sick, she cried, looking up at him with a gaze that made him pause. You're evil. You could have ended it, Evie, he said contemplatively. You could have given in, but you didn't. Why? And with that question, he began to move toward her again, seeming to offer comfort and support. Back against the wall, she slid away, looking toward him as if he were some sort of cockroach. Worse by far than her cell companion, the rat. At least she'd been able to understand what the rat did. Leave me alone, she shouted at him. I hate you. That's it, he said, coming to a halt once more, giving her space. At first I thought it was hate too. Hate was all I knew. Hate had built my world, imprisoned me, taught me how to eat hate, how to drink hate, how to breathe hate. I thought I would die from the hate in my veins, but something happened. It happened to me just as it happened to you. Evie turned away from him then, snapping her eyes shut and covering both ears with her hands. Shut up! She screeched, shaking now with stress and nervous tension as well as the sheer physical weakness left over from her ordeal. I don't want to hear any more of your lies! Your father said that artists use lies to tell the truth, he reminded her. Yes, I created a lie, and because you believed it, you found out something true about yourself. No, she shouted, hunching over, trying to get away, to make him stop, to make everything stop. What was true in that cell is just as true now, V told her insistently, adding pointedly, what you felt in there had nothing to do with me. I can't feel anything anymore. Don't run from it, he carried on, in that same annoying, unrelenting way that she found unnerving about him right from the start, that way he had of forcing her to face unpleasant truths. You've been running all your life.
Yeah, guys, I'm just going to take a quick break. My son's here now. He's just coming into the pissing down rain, so bear with me. Listen to the playlist and carry on.
I can't breathe. Wheezing and moaning, she managed to choke out. Asthma, when I was little. But after that, the words wouldn't come any more than the breath. And Evie felt that this collapse of her body was another final betrayal, and she could do nothing else but cry. Listen to me, Evie, he said in a tone of quiet command. This may be the most important moment of your life. Commit yourself to it. She didn't want to hear it. Didn't want anything except for all this to just stop. to close her eyes as tightly as she could, but somehow the tears kept squeezing out, trickling down her cheeks.
Hang up then, mate.
They took your parents from you. They took the man you'd come to love from you. They put you in a cell and took everything they could take except your life. Please, she managed to gasp, but nothing else would come out. And as V crouched down beside her and placed his hands on her shoulders, she began to bawl like a child. You believed that was all there was, didn't you? He said more gently now. That the only thing you had left was your life. But it wasn't, was it? Evie shook her head,
down there.
tears burning her cheeks. But with that simple gesture of acknowledgement, just a little control came back to her.
Go and get changed, please.
You found something else, he told her, and she knew he was right. Began to know, at last, that he'd been right about everything all along. In that cell you found something that mattered more to you than life itself, because when they threatened to take it, threatened to kill you unless you gave them what they wanted, you told them you would rather die. And with that, her breath began to come back. The panic began to subside, and she sucked in a great lungful of air. You faced your death, Evie, he said softly, almost whispering. You were calm. You were still. Try to feel now what you felt then. She did, and felt that release once more, that sense of putting down all the burdens of the world. And she started to feel a warmth spreading through her entire being, not just her body, but her mind, her soul. Every part of her that had been, was now, would be in the future.
Perhaps a horrible weather here at the moment.
I felt, she began, her eyes clearing now, like an angel. V nodded, remembering similar feelings of his own, and offered her his hand. She took it tentatively at first, then squeezed it tightly, a clasp more eloquent than words. She tried to rise to her feet, only to lurch against him helplessly, mental strength being quite unable to combat physical weakness. I'm dizzy, she said, raising her free hand to her forehead, grateful for his gloved hand and knowing that, without it, she'd be back down on the floor. I need air. Please, I need to be outside. There's a lift. It'll take us to the roof. And then he led her, still helping her walk, across the silent shadow gallery, and to a door she'd always assumed merely led to another room. Instead, it opened to reveal the small elevator cage he'd mentioned. She had no idea how far they had to travel, though the ascent seemed to last forever. Maybe that was because of her distorted sense of time. But she also felt that the shadow gallery must be a considerable distance below the ground, this roof some way above it. More to the point, it was lifting her out of the hell that she'd spent an unknown time in, taking her, if not to heaven, at least back into the world she'd left behind. The world that she now realized, having overcome the fear that had so narrowed and limited her options, was a world of infinite possibility. And then the cage door slid back. The outer door was thrown open, and the silence down below was quite forgotten. The night was rent by a rolling cannonade of thunder that had made her think of the night he'd blown up the Old Bailey, made her expect at any moment to hear Tchaikovsky struck up upon the wind. And the parallel was given added verisimilitude when jagged, blue, forked lightning split the sky open in a spider web of stark electric filaments, before the thunder quaked the low and rolling clouds again. But it wasn't the celestial pyrotechnics that interested Evie. It was the rain that tumbled down from the clouds, splashing and hissing on the flat rooftop before her, making mirror pools that reflected back the lightning flashes, so many little pieces of sky down here upon the earth below. Here, said V, offering his cloak to her. But she simply ignored him. More than that, she wriggled out of the hemp dress she'd worn for far too long and stepped out naked into the pouring rain. Quietly, peacefully, she raised her head and looked straight up into the sky, felt the heavy raindrops lashing down almost vertically, let them wash over her face, shower over her thin, frail, and battered body. not washing away her sins, but her sufferings. All gone now, all behind her, and with them the tempest finally sluiced away her fear for good. God is in the rain, she said slowly, remembering Valbyrie's words, breathing deeply, filling her lungs as if they'd never been used before. And she knew that Valerie had been right. God, whether you thought of him or her or it, was undoubtedly in the rain, in the clouds, the trees, the buildings, the people, in the rat, in everything. And everything, too, was God. And God wasn't just an Englishman, wasn't Sutler's God, wasn't even Christian. God was everybody's God, or gods, or goddesses, and there was only Godhead in the same way as there was only human. And whether you called God Jehovah, or Allah, Zeus, or Odin, Brahma, or the Jade Emperor, so in the same way, whether you were Anglo-Saxon, or African, Arab, Jewish, or Chinese, so you were still called a man, or a woman, or a child. For in the same way that Shylock said, "If you prick us, do we not bleed?" then so the deity, from crucified Christ to idol made of mud, would say besides, "If you worship me, am I not God?" And Evie knew that it was so. And so, for her, it was. And V, watching her, remembered the night he too had achieved this state, not through water, but through fire, not in London, but in Larkhill, not with celestial fireworks, but with explosives of his own. The 5th of November, many years ago, when all the sky was fire, all the world was smoke, and he'd been naked too, not to feel the world upon his skin, but because his clothes had burned off, and much of his skin was quite simply gone. An inferno, not just in the sense of a mighty fire, but in the original meaning of the word, a blazing hell, but somehow, too, a purifying, alchemical flame that burned away the dross of the world, the slag, and left only the silver and the gold. And not only his sufferings had been brought to an end that night, but those of many others besides, one way or another, for better or for worse. And if he had been released that night, then to what greater task could he commit himself thereafter than the release of others still, perhaps of all the world? "Everything's so different," Evie said softly, gently, almost inaudibly through the rain, but just loud enough to draw his attention back from that night of his own, when there'd been no such quiet words, but rather screams and roars. And so it should be. For this was her night, a night the like she'd never known before and never would again. And he would do his best to feel it with her, for all these experiences were as different always as they were the same. Not far away from him, still out there on the roof in a world of tumbling water, Evie began to weep, her tears mingling with the rain, and she, in just the same way, felt her entire being becoming merged with the infinite wall. Overhead, the dancing lightning rent the sky once more with fierce celestial brilliance, cried, "I am," as gods had always done, personified in light, illumination, enlightenment. 18. Days had passed, blurring into weeks, much as they had in her supposed prison. And again Evie had little conception of the passing of time. Not now because of the continued psychological torture that had slowly scoured away her former fears, but because time itself no longer mattered. Instead, there was only the ongoing process of recovery, of feeding and restoring her physical body, of exploring her new mental calm and inner balance, of the previously unappreciated sense not of well-being, but of simply being. Until one day she noticed she had enough hair to riffle her fingers through again, and by the following morning she'd come to a decision. Dressed in street clothes that V had provided, She had to imagine that he had other disguises still with which to go out and shop for her, or perhaps remembering how he'd acquired his artworks to steal for her. And with her bag fully packed, she found V in the main room of the shadow gallery, standing contemplatively by the jukebox, seemingly lost in a world of his own. Or was he plotting further moves in his campaign to bring about the anarchy that he saw as the only answer to the repressions of the fascist state? Even if he didn't wear the expressionless mask, she thought she'd never quite know exactly how his deepest thought processes worked. For despite the little he told her of his own history and the insights given to her during her own imprisonment, she still didn't understand quite what sort of hell he'd gone through at Larkhill. And perhaps, now that the main perpetrators had died at his hand, no one but V ever would. V, she began, not knowing any way to say this except shortly. And besides, there was no point in doing anything else but coming straight out with it. I'm leaving. It hadn't been an easy decision. Outside, the world was harsh, uncaring, dangerous, full of the things that used to scare her so badly that she'd been running away from all her life. And she knew her old life was over anyway. She couldn't go back to her job, her friends, her few surviving relatives, even if she wanted to. What had happened to Gordon Dietrich had been a lesson in itself. She couldn't let the same thing happen again to anyone she knew or held dear, and it would simply because they knew her. But here in the Shadow Gallery was security and art and wonder, the sort of marvellous haven she'd always dreamed of, to be revealed by the magic word she'd always hoped to discover.
Main piece of Parliament in
But
there
she
now.
knew that she no longer needed
Still need to put V in, like we have here. This is the paper version, and I will be doing the sign, the fireworks, and V, either today or maybe come back Sunday, because my son has come home from school now, so sort of he'll take over the living room, and the playlist I'm listening to will get continued and followed on. So guys, keep tuned while I finish this.
But I've never danced to any of them. Did you hear me? She asked, a little taken aback. Yes. I can't stay here, she told him flatly, wondering if, having heard, he still didn't quite understand her. I know, he said, finally turning away from the jukebox to face her, with a smile on the mask seeming sympathetic now, despite that it never changed. Or perhaps it was just the way he held his head, the language of his body. No, it was more than that. She could read his voice much better now, with all its minor inflections and changes of tone, its subtle shades of meaning. You won't find any more locked doors here. She crossed the room toward him, reaching into her bag as she did so, searching for something she'd gone back to her cell to retrieve. I thought about keeping this, she began, finally pulling out the small roll of toilet paper that was Valerie's letter. But it didn't feel right. Knowing you wrote it. I didn't. It was such a simple statement, so simply delivered that she had to believe him. Even so, it came as a complete surprise, shattering another illusory item in her mental picture of things that she'd taken as obviously true. Can I show you something before you go?
Ooh,
he asked then.
No.
Rather hesitantly, never knowing quite what to expect when V had things to show her, she nodded. He led her away through the shadow gallery, then took her to yet another room she hadn't seen before. But the place seemed endless, a labyrinthine collection of rooms beyond rooms, connected by passages that wound around each other, seeming to go nowhere, but finally ending up somewhere quite amazing, all lit only in the most subdued manner, a maze of mysterious gloom and marvel. But what he showed her when he opened up this particular door was perhaps the most surprising yet. The room within was, quite plainly, a shrine. Beneath the same vaulted ceiling found elsewhere in the shadow gallery, the cold severity of the stone walls was softened by richly woven tapestries. The floor was strewn with the sort of thick Persian rugs she'd only seen previously in Bishop Lillinen's bedroom. For a moment that gave her pause for thought, about the hypocrisy that could hide behind the mask of proper organized religions conducting their ceremonies in the plain light of day, and how it contrasted with the obvious and sincere reverence with which V had established this memorial room, and, she was certain, never shown it to another soul before now. There may have been no deity worshipped here, but it was plain that he kept it holy nonetheless. To either side of the room, beneath chain-suspended grow lights, were beds of blooming roses, violet Carson roses. As V led her forward to the inner sanctum, she noticed another bed of violet Carsons growing on what seemed to be the top of some sort of altar, and just beyond that she saw the inner sanctum. A portrait stood in the center, but pasted on the walls all around this were photos, movie posters, press cuttings, and reviews featuring the same woman as the painting. For a moment, Evie couldn't quite understand this previously unrevealed and apparently sentimental side to V's nature, for this was obviously something rather more special than the random collection of old horror and gangster movie posters elsewhere in the Shadow Gallery. This was about a single person, and one that he obviously held particularly dear. But then she noticed the name of the actress, Valerie Page, and one of the posters was for the Salt Flats. She was real? Evie asked softly, wonder in her voice. She began to feel awkward holding the bag and put it on the floor. For just a little while this woman had seemed so important to her, so real, and then so false, when the nature of the prison was revealed. Now apparently real again, both she and reality in general seemed suddenly completely fluid, to the point where reality and falsehood became merged, or transcended. V nodded in answer to her question, bringing her back to a state where, at least in some circumstances,
we're getting a bit of buff, guys. Do apologise for that.
And in doing so, he displayed a real sense of veneration, despite the mask. She's beautiful, said Evie, affected by the same feeling herself. Did you know her? No, said V quietly. She wrote the letter just before she died. I delivered it to you in the same way it had been delivered to me. Then it really happened, didn't it? Said Evie, suddenly overwhelmed. For a while after she discovered that all that had occurred during her detention had been no more than a puppet play where V had pulled the strings, she thought that Valerie's letter was just a fraud. Felt, because of the way it had affected her so deeply, that this was perhaps the greatest betrayal in all the things he'd done to her, necessary though they might have been. But now all the sympathy she had for Valerie's suffering came back to her with redoubled force, and with it a new empathy with V. You were in the cell next to her?
Yeah, it's looking a lot better than
knowing the answer before he nodded an affirmation. So he, then, must have experienced much the same feelings as she had, reading that painful testament of the soon-to-be dead. And that's what this is all about, then, she continued, not in any accusatory fashion, but simply stating what had suddenly become plainly obvious to her. You're getting back at them for what they did to her, and to you. And to us all, she might have added, thinking of how Sutler's thuggery had extended out far beyond the detention camps and interrogation centers, like an all-encompassing cancer that had turned the whole country rotten, made it hell to live in. What they did to me created me, he told her. It's a basic principle of the universe that every action will create an equal and opposing reaction. Is that how you see it? Evie asked, still fascinated, even though she was just about to leave, by the surprises his mental processes threw up, and how they could switch instantly from the apparently sentimental to the almost repellently methodical, like an equation. What they did was monstrous, he replied with a sense of simple acceptance, a plain statement of fact that no longer carried any emotional charge. And they created a monster, she added equally emotionlessly, equally without moral judgment. Whatever he might have thought of her summing up, V said nothing, merely watching her as she bent to pick up her bag once more. And for a few moments they stood there in silence, looking at each other, perhaps for the last time. Then she handed him Valerie's letter, watched him as he reverently placed it back on the shrine from which he'd taken it those days or weeks before, and somehow felt the same sense of reverence herself. As if, in leaving the Shadow Gallery, she was now about to say goodbye to two people, rather than just the one she'd expected. "Do you know where you'll go?" he asked eventually. No. She couldn't help breaking out into a smile. "That would have scared me before. I suppose I should thank you for that." On a sudden impulse, she stepped toward him and looked up into the frozen smile that served him for a face, almost as if she were about to kiss him. But what was the point of kissing a mask? "Thank you," Evie said, adding, just as she was about to turn away, "And goodbye." But before she could leave the shrine, just as she felt that she couldn't resist turning back for a last glance at him before she disappeared from his life forever, he called her name. "Evie, can I ask you for something?" She nodded, wondering what he could have in mind, wondering what she'd do if, at this last minute, he asked her to stay. "If I had one wish," he said, and a note of urgent sadness in his voice emphasized the importance of his request. "It would be to see you again, if only once, before the 5th. For a moment she stood there considering. Would it be better just to make a clean break, to put all this behind her, to never see him again? But after all he'd done for her, whether she'd wanted him to or not, perhaps she could do this one small thing for him in return. "All right," she said softly, graciously, with a smile that somehow forgave him all his sins.
Shit.
"Thank you," he said, returning her a smile that was ever the same, ever fixed, eternally unreadable. And with that she turned and left him. Left, wondering how she'd get on without him. Wondering how he'd get on without her. 19. High Chancellor Adam Sutler glared down from the large screen in the cabinet room, clearly far from happy with the situation being reported to him by his department heads. Were these really the best men available? And were they really making their best efforts to deal with this terrorist imbroglio? Perhaps if he had one of them killed, in full view, pour encourager les autres. Etheridge, for example, the useless little toad. "Based on random audio sweeps," the potential victim was saying now, mumbling nervously as he picked his way through the report he had on the cabinet table before him, doing his best to summarize what he knew the Chancellor could only regard as appallingly bad news. "I've projected that right now 80% of the public believe the terrorist is still alive." Etheridge gulped, took a sip of water from the glass before him, and continued. "We are showing a 12% increase over last month's positive mentions in all 4 quadrants." The Chancellor's glare was withering. Did Hitler have to put up with underlings like these? You get rid of all the scum to make way for your purebred Norse-fire Superman, and you end up with this? As if he knew what his master was thinking, Etheridge tried to shrink back into the shadows, to become invisible, to disappear from view. If only they could make the current unrest disappear as well. On the larger scale, apart from the activities of the terrorist himself, it was little more than talk so far, and an increase in slogan painting and poster defacement. But it was a worrying sign. And there were areas in the East End where they were starting to vandalize the security cameras, where petty crime was increasing, where the police thought it best to patrol in pairs. "Mr. Creedy?" Sutler snapped next, and even the normally cool, calm head of the finger looked a little uncomfortable at the Chancellor's tone. "We're handling it as best we can, Chancellor." Peter Creedy did his best to sound businesslike and efficient. "Our arrests are as high as they've been since the Reclamation." That was something to be proud of, surely. Or if not that, at least it showed that he and his men were on the ball, doing their job. And that there seemed to be more and more people out there who needed to be arrested was perhaps something not really to be gone into just now. Even so, he wasn't quite prepared for Sutler's reaction. "I want more than arrests," he shouted furiously, changing his mind about Etheridge, thinking Creedy would provide a far more effective object lesson. I want results! For a few seconds, the very silence seemed to hum with the violence of the Chancellor's outburst, and the assembled department heads could do nothing but look down at the table before them, averting their gazes, nerves taut, minds racing. Was the old tyrant starting to lose it? Was this damned terrorist situation actually starting to get to him? And if he was becoming unstable, what about the fallout? Who'd catch the flak? More to the point, who'd eventually come out on top, with his boot on the neck of the others, if there were any others left? Eventually, the silence was broken by the rustle of papers being nervously shuffled as they prepared to move on to the next item on the agenda, hoping that by the time they got to it, Sattler's glowering face would have settled back into something more like its normal expression. Only Eric Finch allowed himself the slightest of smirks at Creedy's discomfort. Serve the bastard right. After all the shit he'd been giving Finch lately, it was about time the evil sod got it in the neck for a change. Finally, Conrad Hare cleared his throat nervously. I beg your pardon, Chancellor, he began tentatively, not sure why it had fallen on him to bring up the matter of the report that the various department heads had communally been responsible for assembling, or all but one of them anyway. He'd rather expected Creedy to press forward with the presentation, grabbing all the attention as usual, but after the bollocking the fingerman had just got, perhaps it wasn't surprising that he didn't. Dascombe didn't give a shit about the Houses of Parliament, so long as his news teams were on site to report events, and Etheridge certainly wasn't the man for the job. Finch wouldn't anyway, so it was down to him. I know no one wants to discuss this, he continued with a rather accusing glance at his silent companions, then started to get into his stride. But if we're to be prepared for every eventuality, then it can't be ignored any longer. The Red report before this meeting has been vetted by several demolition specialists. It concludes that the most logical delivery system for the terrorist to use would be an airborne attack. He paused, having brought the important matters to the Chancellor's attention, and glanced round toward Finch. Well, he supposed one more thing had to be said, ridiculous as everyone else had agreed it was. However, a separate report has been filed suggesting an underground train, despite the fact that the tunnels surrounding Parliament have been sealed shut. Who filed that report? Sattler asked, the sneer on his face already suggesting what he thought of the idea. Chief Inspector Finch, Hare told him, passing the buck with considerable alacrity. Do you have any evidence to support that conclusion, Inspector? Said the Chancellor from the screen, fixing Finch with a stare. No, sir, he replied honestly. After all, he didn't. Just a feeling. If I am sure of anything, Inspector Finch, said Sattler with cold, heavy emphasis, it is that this government will not survive if it is to be subject to your feelings. Across the table, Creedy grinned wolfishly at Finch, returning contempt for contempt, with added interest besides. Well, thought Finch, they'd see. And he'd far rather trust a copper's instincts than he would the absolute certainties of a jumped-up Nazi throwback like Adam Sattler. If he trusted anyone, or anything at all, any longer. Finch knew the look on Dominic's face as the young man entered the office they shared at New Scotland Yard and closed the door behind him, even before he gave the signal they'd arranged. Even so, Finch thought, as he pulled out the debugging device from his desk and switched it on. His assistant was looking particularly harassed this morning. My friend inside the finger came up with something, Dominic said quietly, despite the device. Then, with a furtive glance around him, even though he knew full well they were quite alone, he reached into his pocket and handed Finch a disk, which the latter immediately began loading into his computer. There were 3 men, Dominic said, joining his boss behind the desk as the file began to open. Covert intelligence, original black baggers, all under Creedy. Alan Percy, Finch began to read from the screen, Robert Keyes, and William Rookwood. The day after the St. Mary's outbreak, Dominic filled in for him. Percy gave his Beretta a blowjob, Keyes dies in a fire, and Rookwood goes missing. Finch concluded for him, looking at the information on the screen. Bloody coincidences are making me sick to my stomach, Dominic remarked, no longer believing in coincidence any more than Finch did. Rookwood? Finch asked meditatively, trying to put his finger on something he couldn't quite remember. Rookwood? Why do I know that name? A hunch, an instinct, one of those feelings Sattler despised so much. And Finch opened his mailbox, typed the name into the search facility, and found an unopened email from William Rookwood. Holy Christ! Exclaimed Dominic softly, looking over his boss's shoulder. Finch opened the message and began to read it. Dear Inspector, I understand you're looking for me. I can only assume this means you are ready for the truth. If so, return this email and I will send contact details. W.R. He must have had a hidden trip on his file at the Finger, Dominic said, though his satisfaction at working out the solution soon gave way to puzzlement again. But how did he know it was you? Finch shook his head. Sometimes there were questions even Copper's instincts couldn't answer. So what do we do? Dominic asked nervously, fearing the answer, but guessing it already. I'm a cop, Finch told him, clicking on the reply button. I have to know. Shit, breathed Dominic softly, horribly afraid that that was exactly what they were going to get into. The St. Mary's Mausoleum and Memorial was one of those huge memorial buildings that fascist imperialist regimes seem to do so well, or so badly, depending on one's personal taste. Gigantic, imposing, monumental, the sort of tribute the hapless victims so richly deserved. Or overblown, overbearing, and oppressive, the sort of monstrosity an evil government erected to make it feel better about itself. For Finch and Dominic, there wasn't any argument about which. I came when they opened it, the younger man shuddered. Gave me the collywobbles. He looked around him at the fountains, the lilies, the centerpiece statue of playing children, their angelic faces frozen into cold eternity by the snow-white marble, their running legs never quite going anywhere, and the toys and games they held unplayed, at the vast line of slabs engraved and gilded with the names of what seemed the near infinite dead. Still does, Dominic added, and Finch knew exactly what he meant. He'd never been a great fan of mortuary sculpture, beautiful as he knew the Christs and angels in the alcoves round the walls to be. And what was worse about this place was that, for all it looked like a fond and loving tribute to the little ones who died, and a fitting replacement for St. Mary's School, now demolished, it was actually built on the site of the playground where they'd excavated the mass grave to dump the bodies into before the infection spread. A massive tombstone, then, built on a giant grave. Still, they hadn't come to contemplate the past, but to disinter it. And the man they needed to help them do that was William Rookwood. The place seemed largely empty at this time of the morning. It was after the still grieving relatives had paid their respects on their way to work, before the school parties were brought along by their teachers. Round at the back was a museum section with photos and memorabilia of the victims and the school, most of the latter almost certainly false, considering the way the clean-up crews had eradicated everything while disinfecting. The Museum of Dead Children, it was commonly known as, and organised visits were a compulsory part of the curriculum of all the schools in London to learn the lessons of history and the necessity of vigilance against the threats of the future. A history Finch now suspected was completely false. A future threat he thought less likely to come from without than from those who were actually supposed to protect the citizens of tomorrow. But the place wasn't entirely empty. A soft cough brought to their attention a man sitting on a marble bench in a shadowy corner of the memorial, almost hidden by a bed of pure white lilies. Finch and Dominic glanced toward each other, and then started toward him. That's close enough, Inspector, said the man silently, and they stared at him, remembering the tall, relatively slim, clean-shaven man that Rookwood had appeared to be from the photo in his file. Instead, they saw a large, almost fat and heavily bearded man wearing dark glasses, a wide-brimmed hat pulled down low to shade his face, and a heavy, dark coat. By his side was a small bag, and his gloved hands fiddled with a heavy, silver-headed cane that would obviously double as a weapon, even if it didn't contain the blade Finch rather suspected it did. The beard looked real enough, but Dominic thought the coat covered several layers of padding. Not surprisingly, Rookwood lived in darkness and disguise. Outside it began to rain again, beating a soft tattoo on the marble paving surrounding the memorial, and bringing an added chill to the air, as if Eric Finch didn't already feel cold enough inside, when he thought about everything they'd uncovered so far, and which, he suspected, was probably going to get far worse by the time they'd finished interviewing their man. "You're Rookwood?" Finch asked, receiving a nod in reply. And then the man reached into his bag and drew out a debugging device very much like Finch's and turned it on. "We're not wired," Finch told him, knowing very well Rookwood would be a fool to take him at his word, but feeling he wanted to say it anyway. "I'm sorry," Rookwood said, "but a man in my position only survives by taking every precaution." Finch nodded understandingly, gesturing toward a bench not far from the one on which Rookwood sat, and when the latter appeared to give his consent, sitting down on it with Dominic. "You have information for us?" Finch asked. "No. You already have the information." Rookwood nodded his head forward and seemed to sink even farther down into the shadows. "All the names and dates are inside your head. What you want, what you really need, is a story." "The story can be true or false," Finch remarked, a touch exasperated. This was supposed to be an investigation, not a game. "I leave such judgments to you, Inspector." The ghost of a smile played round Rookwood's bearded lips, barely visible in the shadow. Then he tapped his cane on the marble floor as if calling for his audience's attention. "Our story begins, as these stories often do," said Rookwood, "with a young, up-and-coming politician. He is a deeply religious man and a member of the Conservative Party. He is completely single-minded and, before too long, regardless of the political process." Finch knew well enough to whom Rookwood was referring. Adam Sutler, swiftly outgrowing his Conservative roots, setting up his own Norse Fire organization that so many people had initially regarded as a joke. Adam Sutler, the man who talks to God, they called him derisively, in those days when God had long been declared dead, hardly foreseeing the crushing return the church would make a few years later, reorganized now as an arm of the party. They'd also said a neo-Nazi outfit like Norse Fire would never take root here, not in England, not in the mother of democracy. Called them nasties, and laughed every time they were mentioned, quite forgetting Oswald Mosley's black shirts back before the Second World War, forgetting that had been a movement that had appealed to all classes of society, from the working-class bigot to the aristocratic toff. It was led by Sir Oswald Mosley, after all, while most of its supporters came from the East End. But if they did remember Mosley, it was only as an old joke, a minor aberration, certainly not a serious warning. And they also failed to remember Thatcher, Blair, and all the others who'd sent the country lurching dangerously toward the right, but had made a better show of disguising their intentions. Good, honest Christians, too, the lot of them. History's lessons, still unlearned. Even when the rallies had started, when the symbols started to appear, the double crosses, which with hindsight should have tipped someone off as to what was going on, even when the armbands and the uniforms appeared, the red and black motifs, when the salutes began, surely it should have been obvious by then. But no, fascists the world over have always known how to put on a good show, to play the crowd, to give the people what they want, and once they've got the fat heads in and listening, to tell them what they want to hear, or at least to tell them what the party propaganda had already persuaded them that they wanted to hear, after that same propaganda had subverted the information they received, their moral values, their very humanity. The same old messages of hate, that the country's full of degenerates and idolaters, especially in the schools where they can corrupt the helpless children, that hordes of asylum seekers are taking the jobs, that all the Arab ragheads are nothing but terrorists in disguise, that the Yids have got the money, the Jippos are nothing but a bunch of burglars, the Yardi gangs have got the protection rackets sewn up, all the vice is run by Albanian immigrants, The triads are smuggling in more foreigners every day, and there's no point going into town tonight unless you want to eat curry. And then there are the Spicks, the Wops, the Krauts, and worst of all, the Frogs. Quite plainly communists to a man. Put them all on the boat back home and sink it when they leave. England for the English, strength through unity, unity through faith. England prevails. Rookwood's words broke into Finch's memories. The more power he attains, the more obvious his zealotry, the more aggressive his supporters become. It was true enough, after all. Finch
Okay, guys. Well, I'm going to end that playlist here.
More and more shameful to him now. The more of this poison, this filth he was on.
I'm going to end the playlist here, guys, and I will say goodbye for now. I will continue on with this on a later date. But as for now, it has come to an end. Hopefully you have enjoyed today's video and you are enjoying the playlist in the background. And if anybody would like to leave a comment after the stream has ended, you can do. You can also come over to Instagram, where I'm live every other day or every day, making some sort of post to let you guys know what I'm getting up to and where I will be going with my channel next. Again, this month is all about fire and fireworks, and why not start the week off with the 5th of November with Guy Fawkes, and this has been V for Vendetta. If you have liked that playlist in the background, guys, I will conclude it in the next video. But thank you very much for watching this today's video. I do apologize that I was a lot later than normal, but I had to wait for something to upload before I could actually go live. Again, my name is Blut084, BLUT084, Art and Games. Here every day on YouTube, occasionally on Mixer, but every day and night over on Instagram. So, and again, guys, I will continue this either Saturday or Sunday, so tune in on those days. But don't forget to subscribe for more content and hit that bell so you don't miss the last part of this sketch and digital artwork. If you want to see how I sketch this on paper, don't forget to click the other videos, put them in the corner, scroll down and find those for yourself, or this will be in the playlist of Fire and Fireworks. Or if you want to see any other artwork by me, check out last month's theme, which was dark theme, or dark month as it's called. So check that one out if you want to see some more. But if you're a fan of Spider-Man, there are some pictures in the live events playlist to teach you how to draw the punk Spider-Man. But otherwise, guys, enjoy the gaming and art on my channel. Thank you very much, guys. I will see you again next time. Thank you very much for tuning in, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.